Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Kasterborous. My name is Christian Cawley. His name is James McLean. And we are here to discuss things related to Doctor Who and things tangentially related to Doctor Who, as ever, really. I noticed, I should probably say something about what's going on with Patreon and stuff, actually. So before we get into that, we have a video chat, myself and James, discussing the early years of Kasterborous. That's just gone online a few days ago. I have an audio clip. Now, there's some selection of audio clips I told you about a few weeks ago that Brian Turnover has given us. They are being uploaded, and I've got the first one ready to go. It has some interesting context to it, but it is Brian chatting with Paul McGann. And it's a nice chat. I can't say too much, but it's definitely worth listening to. So that'll be available to check out probably this weekend around the same time as you're listening to this. So do look out for that as well. And there's lots more to come. I put a list up and I've misplaced the list, but generally there's a lot of people. There's Ian McNeice, there's Sylvester McCoy, there's Daphne Ashbrook. There's 9 or 10 interviews in total. There's a lot of people. There's Terry Malloy as well. And Terence Dix, I think. I remember Brian telling me that he didn't remember speaking to either of them. So I'm not sure. How do you forget that? I'm not sure. But so they're coming up. So do look out for those. And as I say, the Paul McGann one's coming along soon. I'll tell you about the Paul McGann one off air, James, because it's quite interesting. So what we're going to be talking about is Mark Gatiss and kind of some comments that he's been reported as saying in an interview concerning Doctor Who, and maybe he's maybe a look at his sort of maybe not a look, a précis of his relationship with Doctor Who. The Doctor Who companion has shared a quote that's been reported widely in which Mark Gatiss says, Russell does just per like no one else. I don't know much about what happened. If Shooty was going to do 3 years but only did 2, it was certainly a surprise that he was going, wasn't it? It's like the ultimate cliffhanger, isn't it? It's like Sherlock in the Reichenbach Fall. It's like, well, this is a big one. And I mean, in a funny kind of way, it absolutely bookends the 2005 new show onwards. It's all about Billy. And then guess what? So I haven't a clue. I know there's a Christmas special this year, isn't there? And after that, who knows? So there's a couple of things there. There's this idea that maybe he wasn't going to do more than 2 series at all. And there's also this thing that no one really knows what's going on either. And there's another aspect to this as well. And there's a comment I saw on Twitter where someone was really disparaging about Mark Gatiss' Doctor Who episodes. And I was thinking, there's absolutely no argument in favour of that, in my opinion. They're a good mix of episodes.
Some of them are okay for me.
Oh yeah, but not are any of them terrible though? That's what I'm saying.
Which ones are we talking about then? So we're talking about The Unquiet Dead.
Unquiet Dead, Crimson Horror, I think is Mark Gatiss.
Mm-hmm.
That was a good one, I think. That was one of my preferred episodes from that series. Did he pen the World War II Dalek story?
My brain says yes.
Yeah, see, mine says yes as well. So, the Unquiet Dead, the Idiot's Lantern. I mean, Idiot's Lantern is a scary one. It's not the best episode, but I think that's down to maybe there's maybe some sort of like pacing issues with it or direction. Victory of the Daleks, Night Terrors, Cold War, Crimson Horror, Robot of Sherwood, Sleep No More, Empress of Mars.
But yeah, I don't see why. I think there's always this really no offense to the person who made that comment, but slightly irritating dissonance between your opinion and the validity of that opinion based on an creative output that you've done, which isn't entirely your own creative output. You know, if it was like maybe a not very good author having a go at a classic author, then you go fine. But, you know, these are shows which it's not just Mark Gatiss involved. So how The Idiot Lantern landed is not necessarily Mark Gatiss's
exactly
fault or success. You know, it's other factors involved. So I don't like this sort of notion of like, and then that being used to sort of say, well, kind of like, what do you know because of X? And it's like, well, two things can be true in the same way that as a person, you can make a comment about Mark Gatiss without having done what Mark Gatiss has done. And
Mm,
there's a, I'm not a massive, I'm not, I mean, there's a nice spread of stories there. You can't say that he sort of sticks to a lane. There's a lot of different things he's done in the show. I quite liked his books in the 90s.
yeah,
St. Anthony's Fire, I quite enjoyed. Um, as I say, none of his stories particularly stand out for me. That are ones that I would leap to. But again, that's personal preference. It's nothing to do with how good he is. And again, that makes no difference to what he says here. Um, these things happen. I mean, if you look at he says about Sherlock and just thinking of Moffat and Gatiss's work on the TV show Sherlock, there was that massive gap between, is it series 2 and 3? I can't remember which series it was, which had an impossible conundrum, which was a terrible payoff at the end, partially because they left it so long
yeah,
that there's so many theories had come out that there was no way that they could do anything that was satisfying. And that happens sometimes. I still feel like there's no doubt in my mind that, absolutely no doubt in my mind, that Gatwa left before they anticipated him to leave. No doubt at all. You can just look at the changes in that episode, that final episode. The talks of rewrites, changes to the end scenes. You've got Caroline Ford saying that it was entirely different originally.
yeah.
It's like, yeah, probably because he wasn't meant to disappear. So there's no doubt that he left early, and then they tried to do the best with what they could. Did it work totally? I don't think it worked totally. I think it'd have been interesting to. It would be lovely to see the original script, just to see how, if things had gone as planned, how it would have gone.
Yeah. Gatiss has said a few other things. It looked great. The Disney money obviously did something, but in the end, it's essentially a spooky show. It's a weird show, and that's what I've always adored about it. It's not like anything else. And actually, when it tries to be like something else, it's not Doctor Who. I think in the end, the thing to absolutely cherish and cling on to is that it's very much its own thing, and that's why we've always loved it.
That to me makes no sense. Okay, I'm going to spin on that. That's
Okay.
a I've heard that someone else said that recently, something similar, and it's like this is a 60-year show. It's like Batman. No one can actually say what Batman is
Yeah.
because whenever you came into Batman, that kind of is what Batman is for you.
Yeah.
Whether
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
Adam West, Bale, Keaton, the comics, whatever. It just depends. I mean, Doctor Who has a legacy. I mean, look at the back of the 70s, how much it's trying to be Star Wars. Look at, it's part of its anchor in the 70s again and the 80s too, was its satire, not just satire on politics, but also homages to, Hinchcliffe's Gothic homages. You can't say that Doctor Who is a specific thing. You can, yeah, it's good when it's weird, but it wasn't that weird in Davison's era. It was actually played fairly straight, and I think there's some good stuff in there, and some good stuff. I just don't think. I think it always comes down to people just being human beings and just trying to stake their feelings about it as being the truth. That
Hmm.
and yeah, I just don't subscribe to it because I think it also becomes a bit of a generational thing where you end up sort of saying, well, it was better in my day, and that
Mm.
kind of discredits the people who have grown up with Gatiss and sorry, Gatiss with Catwa, and really loved his stuff, and that was their doctor. It's like we can't do that. It is Doctor Who is always a reflection of its time, always has been, and the sort of cultural questions and thinkings and wars that we're having now is reflected in Doctor Who now as it was reflected in the 70s and to some degree in the 80s and maybe not directly in the 60s, but some of the attitudes and beliefs are in there as well that are up for contest. So I think we just need to step back from this whole thing about what Doctor Who is. I mean, Doctor Who is what it is for that generation, what it is for that culture. That's what it's reflecting. It's so weird, and I think sometimes it's funny when you think back to like Age of Steel and the rise of the Cybermen. And at the time, I found that really a bit on the nose. That they
Mm.
all had ear pods, and everyone was now totally trapped in their ear pods. And let's face it, 20 years later, that satire has largely become a reality. Everyone is locked into phones, and the system of phones and how the algorithms, how the companies work, is very similar to kind of what was being prophesized in Davis's stuff in 2005. And I think that's kind of fun. But it was reflecting some other thoughts and things at the time, which at the time felt crass. But now I look back and go, actually, yeah, mate, you were bang on. That it was an over reflection, but it was an over reflection which actually occurred.
I've discussed elsewhere issues of algorithms and advertising and direct advertising and targeted advertising. And I mean, there was a suggestion some years ago that phones were listening to people
Mm.
and then, selecting adverts based on conversations, etc. And it was kind of debunked at the time. I think it's been rebunked more recently. I think I've seen some reports. And a funny thing happened to me this morning. I was driving the children to school. This isn't a long journey. It's about 5 or 6 minutes each way. And two adverts came on in the car which seemed hugely relevant to me in a bizarre way. In the way adverts don't usually, because normally I normally blank adverts out. That's not usually something that really they don't interest me. I don't like having them on, but if I haven't got Spotify, plugged up in, I'm just going to turn this off. If I don't have Spotify plugged in, then it's the radio. And one of them was about a game, or an optician's advert that referenced a game that kids play in the car. I thought, all right, that's fair enough, because maybe other people do that, although I'd never heard of it before I did it. And then the next advert referenced kid doing video calls with his crush. I was thinking, hold on, this is getting like very much targeted at my family. This pair of adverts. No, this is a car radio advert. I don't believe that digital radios have like unique identifiers. I might be wrong about that. Something for me to look into. But the point is that that's the thing with the earpods and the engagement with the phones and stuff. I think that's part of a sort of a general look at technology that was happening then.
Yeah.
If we go to the Minority Report movie, that's got targeted advertising in it. You literally, there's characters walking around and there are adverts shown at them directly. And we're in that state now where that's a thing. I mean, I looked into how anyone can set up a system using just like a basic PCB, a Raspberry Pi, to detect the presence of a mobile device and display an ad, just be prompted to play an ad or whatever. So it's a very simple system that's in place, and it's all over the place. And we've got cameras. I think we discussed the whole panopticon thing, its actual meaning, a few editions ago. But we literally have cameras everywhere. But there's cameras everywhere in before there's cameras everywhere, I suppose. In Doctor Who, in Last of the Time Lords, you've got the Master surveilling the Doctor and Martha and Jack. So I think Russell was very, very much on the ball with that stuff then. There's different... What he did with the last two series of Doctor Who, certainly not so much the special, with the last two series of Doctor Who, that's a different world that he's reflecting, I think.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying, is that the conversations and how we have the conversations has changed radically in 20 years.
Yeah.
Some would argue for the worst, maybe some would argue for the better, I don't know, but it has definitely changed. And I think what he was doing there is kind of what Doctor Who was always pioneered to do. It was always a kind of ahead of the curve. The character, this was, while every other TV show was having a male female lead who are sexually attracted to each other and will they, won't they, and or the James Bondian, the success of the story, the guy gets the girl, that's kind of the trophy for winning. Doctor Who was doing none of that. He was doing a really different thing. And I think that's always been the great thing about the show. It's always tried to push boundaries. And obviously, whenever anything tries to push boundaries, and you can go back and look at letters of the time and reflections of fans of the time, all the way through, in the same with Star Trek and all these sci-fi shows, fans are always kicking back that this is not right, this is not working. And sometimes it generally perhaps doesn't work. So I'm not trying to sort of say Gatwa's era was absolutely perfect. There was stuff in it I didn't like. That last episode was, to me, pretty, well, it was pretty atrocious in a lot of ways. But I think Doctor Who is always a cultural beast, which is very much reflecting cultural questions. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. I mean, Minority Report is a fascinating one because, again, I think it's always fascinating when you see things at the time and you go, "Oh, I can see this an allegory for the future of
Mm.
what could happen." And then in the future, you get there and you go, "Oh, hang on, I can almost see now this sort of AI language models being used to predict based on a CV the long-term employability or viability of this candidate, and almost trying to predict the future outcomes, and that becoming those sort of things, which again is not
Yeah.
this quite the same as Report, but this idea of predictive
Yep.
futures governing what you do at the time. Yeah, I could see that becoming a model if people aren't careful. And I think we're in an era now where, weirdly enough, we're starting to see again. I suppose like the 60s brought, the journeys to the moon and the like, reflecting on where science fiction had been wondering about space. We're sort of almost at a point now where we're seeing some of those 20 to 30-year-old predictions of where society would be becoming far more real than Back to the Future too.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a weird space. We're not quite in the space of like Blade Runner where we've got AI. We're not looking at replicants. We're looking, as we've said before, sort of advanced pattern recognizing smart language models. They're not
Yeah.
replicants. So I don't think we're in that sort of space. But yeah, we're in a sort of like a weird Minority Report space, an Age of Steel sort of space. Again, not the Cybermen, but just this notion that everyone is systematically and to some degree through commercial ventures and sometimes political gain strategically embedded into a network culture. It's very
Yeah.
hard to escape it. I was watching what's the show with the slow horses guy did author did the Cemetery Road one, and I was watching it and I was thinking, if I was to do thrillers these days, I would not be setting them now. I'd be setting them 20 years ago because there's so
Mm.
many points in that show where I'm thinking, but she's still got a mobile phone switched on. You know, they've just used money. There's just
Yeah.
so many things which say if you were to be on the run now, you couldn't do if you were legitimately on the run from any service because
Yeah.
you would be tracked.
Yeah.
And it's almost to a point where if you're going to do the fun spy thriller thing, you've got to take it 20 years back where there's a little more freedom. Otherwise, you've got to really think about how you acknowledge those complexities that technology has created in today to actually be able to do the on the run thing. And it's a lot harder
Yeah.
because we live in, some would call it a surveillance state, some would call it, whatever you want to call it, but there's a lot of monitoring through
Certainly
commercial,
connected.
connected and networked. Yeah, it's definitely a network space, and it's very hard to break out of a web, which is, what we're in. If you're worried about your phone listening, to some degree, it's like what do you remove your social media apps? Do you remove the apps which, if they were listening, would be the ones that would be listening? It's going to be
Mm.
the ones which are, now obviously if you believe that it's more insidious than that and Google's listening to you and the likes, then that's a harder if you've got like if you've got an Android
Yeah.
phone and the like. But
Yeah.
I don't know whether those are true and how so much time is serendipity, where or is it serendipity? No, it's not serendipity. What's the word when things happen?
Coincidence?
Yeah, but it's that sort of coincidental thing where you sort of make those connections where there's
Connections. Yeah.
almost like a zeitgeist thing going on, and it's just reflecting what you're thinking about reflects the mood and attitudes which
Sure.
marketing is already found and is targeting, and so you think, oh, that's at me, but in fact it's actually a wider. But yeah, I suppose we're getting away from way away from what Gatiss was saying about Doctor Who, but I also someone else said, I'm trying to think, it was this idea that Doctor Who is too. It was more recently. It was one of the Doctor Who people that Doctor Who has become too big. That it's better when it's smaller.
Okay.
I'm sure it
Let's have a
wasn't
look.
Mark. It was someone else. And I remember reading that and sort of thinking, oh, that's a bit of a swing. And again,
I'm just going to look that up because I recall that as well.
it's I'm gonna kick myself when you say who it was.
If I can find it.
No, I'm sure someone said it. This is going to be a fun bit
Was
of the
it Peter
podcast.
Capaldi?
It was Capaldi, yeah. It was
Yes, it was.
Capaldi,
Yeah.
yeah. That, and I think that's always an interesting thing. And again, it comes back a bit to the Blake Seven podcast that we did recently. It's like, is it to some degree, is that true with Doctor Who? Is there a certain, but then again, like with Doctor Who, a lot of the people who have issues with it now are people who grew up with it in 2005. It's not just people when it was uh, cardboard sets or whatever you want to say. So I don't know. It's like again, it's such a big beast. It's hard to say, what is Doctor Who? With Blake Seven, you can say what is Blake Seven because it remained largely consistent over 4 years. It was a small period of time.
Yeah.
Doctor Who, it's a lot harder to say what should Doctor Who be like. If Gareth Cabana had his way, it would be a show which I'd have a lot less interest in than he would, and vice versa, because mine would probably be very much a Bidmead sort of way. So it's like it's hard to distill what it should be, and that can be fun. But I do think a lot of the time we end up critiquing it based on what we think it should be, rather than maybe what it has to be,
Yeah.
or what one individual is trying to make it be.
Peter Capaldi said the show became very, very big, and it was never like that when I loved it. So it became a different thing. I think the responsibilities of playing the part became more. There were more of them. I mean, I think in the old days, if you were John Pertwee or Tom Baker or something like that, you spent most of your year making it and then a bit of your year promoting it. But it wasn't this in-your-face kind of thing that was really important to the BBC or suddenly really important to a brand that had to be maintained. It was just a show that some kids really loved and other kids didn't care about but wanted to watch football, or you grew out of it. It became this sort of very important thing, I think less in a cultural way and more in an economic way. I can see his point there. He's not
Yeah,
necessarily saying that it's too big globally. He's saying that its scale has been changed not by culture but by economics.
but it's still a danger. It's still a dangerous retrospective because
Hmm.
that model now would mean that the show wouldn't exist. So, and I know he's not. I'm be careful. I'm not putting words into his mouth because he's not necessarily saying that. He's sort of saying that that Doctor Who for him was great when it was this more underground is probably the wrong word for it, but
Modest?
less modest, less important thing
Hmm.
where it wasn't such a beast. And I kind of understand what you mean. I think what I find interesting in that is like, is he reflecting on his own time there?
Hmm.
Is this not like a reflection? Because it came out, this conversation came out recently, less about Gatwa, but just more about how it's been since it came back and become this
Yeah.
BBC flagship. And I've never really seen him talk about Doctor Who since his time in Doctor Who in a way which is, I've seen him talk about it and he's never rude about it. But for someone who grew up with Doctor Who, someone who, was photographed with Tom Baker and Liz Sladen
And John Pertwee.
and John Pertwee and, had this passion. I feel post Doctor Who, I never see that same passion. And I wonder whether that sort of bigness of it was part of the factors for
I
him,
think,
which kind of,
I mean, it's a tiring job, isn't it? We've
mm.
seen this mentioned previously, and it's probably wore him out a lot. He's
Yeah, as I
probably
said,
enjoying the rest.
I've not seen him being rude at all about it. I just
No, no.
don't see the passion to talk about it in the same
Yeah.
way I see it with Tennant. You see Tennant will just dive into and just embrace that part of him. Capaldi seems a little more reluctant to do it, and as such an Uber fan, I sometimes find that a bit surprising. He will talk about it very politely in interviews, but I just don't feel like he feels it's something that he wants to define him or be
Yeah.
defined by, which is an Uber fan. You sometimes you could almost find surprising, and I don't know whether that's just a professional caution or whether that is the experience of it, as you say, is just created fatigue for him, and it associates a bit with fatigue.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
Or maybe he's just a multifaceted man and just has lots of strings to his bow, and it's just one area, and he would like to talk about other areas, which he does. I was listening to him this week actually on the off menu podcast, the Acaster Ed Gamble one, and it's a very good interview. If you've not heard it, he's one of the few times you heard him sort of like kind of genuinely laugh and seem quite comfortable in an interview space. But he does talk about Doctor Who there, and they do ask him questions about it. But you don't, given that he was like this massive fan. I don't know. There's a couple of moments where you feel the knowledge is there, but yeah, maybe I imagine acting in it at the moment, coming out of that space, whether you're a Capaldi, a Gatwa, a Tennant, a Whitaker, even still in Eccleston, the size, the scale of it is a Star Trek scale, isn't it, rather than a previous scale? You know, you are now attached to that monster in a way which is global.
Yeah.
You know, you could use back in the day that Capaldi's talking about. You know, Pertwee could do an appearance here and then go to the States and be relatively free to do what he, you know, to enjoy his holiday. You won't be able to do that so much now. Uh, but yeah, I think it's interesting just looking and seeing how people who've been involved in the show reflect on the show. I think that's um, quite a fun thing to explore. Uh, and also that frustration that we never really know really what is going on at a single time in the show either. So that speculation that even, you know, Gatiss is very politely saying, you know, I don't know what happened, but as a watcher and as someone who's been part of Doctor Who, I find it fascinating. And he's obviously trying to
Yeah.
carefully choose his words because I think he is sort of, I don't know. I mean, he's right. And we've talked about this before. There is a lovely bookend. If Doctor Who finished now, which we know it isn't because it's back at Christmas, in a sense, it feels a really British ending to the show. If we think of it 2005 to 2025 rather than the previous lot, that, you know, it starts with Billy, it ends with Billy. And it ends with Billy in a quirky, weird, almost British-like way, where it's an open-ended, weird cliffhanger, which would be remembered for it. You know, people talk about, oh yeah, Doctor Who, yeah, and it ended with the Doctor eventually turning into his companion. You know, what was that all about? If it was going to end, that's actually a pretty good end for the show. Like Blake Seven's ending was very good, even though it was allegedly Chris Boucher says it wasn't intended to be the ending. Is probably what's kept Blake Seven in the British, you know, British cult underground river Styx gravy train. I can't think what the metaphor is because that ending is so powerful. If that was the ending with Billy being the Doctor for whatever reason, think yeah, that's not a bad call. Um, but
Yeah.
and I
I
yeah,
just on the matter of Billy Piper, I mean it is an interesting thing. It baffles me slightly that that should be what it is, that it, because if it is that, then you've got this kind of strange crystallization of 20 years of a TV show almost being sort of just like the iconography of it just like is ultimately just Billy Piper.
yeah. Well, I
Which
mean,
is
but
weird
yeah,
because, you know,
yeah,
someone who grew up in the
yeah,
1990s, she was just like
yeah,
short-lived singer, and
yeah.
then she moved into acting. And but the other thing is that she's rumored to be one of the Masked Singer contestants,
All right.
and there was a the kids sit and watch this on a Saturday night, and I make pizza every other Saturday night from scratch. I just want to say that the full effort goes into it.
Wow.
And I also make a dairy free vegan, partly vegan one, but with vegan cheese for my little girl because she has a dairy allergy. So for my youngest, so we sit down and we watch it, and this voice came on. I think that's an astonishing voice. And then someone said I don't know if it was Jonathan Ross or whoever said Billy Piper, and I was thinking, oh, actually maybe it is. But then again, if Billy Piper can sing like that, why on earth was she doing these crappy pop songs? Well, yeah, that's another matter entirely. So it does, but just getting back onto the point of Doctor Who and 20 years of it, and Mark Gatiss, who did the third episode, um, it would be weird for it all to be crystallized into, you know, like in 15 years' time, like, oh, remember when they brought back Doctor Who and it was all about Billy Piper? It seems
Well,
strange.
I suppose the argument would be less about it being about Billy Piper, but I would just say the fundamental argument is that Doctor Who was always about the companion, was always
Hmm,
about the follow, you know, the person exploring the world through this person. And
yeah.
at the end, the Doctor becomes almost that person in some weird, again, some weird metaphor for the show. Um, but I kind of like that. I mean, as we said, the whole show doesn't make sense in that sort of road. But yeah, from, you know, the 90s onwards, Doctor Who has largely been about the companion. You know, the new
Yeah.
adventures were very much companion direct driven, and the Doctor would sometimes not appear till page 80.
Yeah, yeah.
So, in a sense, it makes sense, and I quite like it for that. I obviously don't want it to end like that, but I would say the show would have a respectful ending. Even my issue with the final episode, as we've talked about this before, when we talk about the episode, is not that crystallization. I think that's fine. I think that adds a bit of question or query, maybe something new to think about with Doctor Who. At the time, people hate these things, but they become legacy. You know, the Valiard being a very good example, the Doctor being half human. These become talking points which propel the show on to rethink itself and remodel itself. But it was just a like 20 long, awkward minutes at the end of this story where you just felt the story was just didn't know what it was doing because it was clearly in rewrite.
Yeah.
That was its problem, not to me, not Billy Piper. I thought that was a bit of fun. Yeah, and the show needs to do that. And I think we've always got to remember that even when the show was, as Peter Capaldi said, this almost silly thing that some people in the playground loved and others were interested in sports or some grew out of, it was still doing something on the BBC that no show around the world was doing in terms of like its longevity. This whole idea that they'd built into the format this way that you could change lead actor, you could change your lead, your female lead, you could change the genre of the show. It could tap into anything. That is in terms of television, that is clearly almost like the ultimate model of making television, isn't it? If you're making a long-running
Yeah, I
show,
guess, yeah.
long-running
Yeah,
show
yeah.
which can be perpetuated by different production people, different actors can play it. You can draw on whatever resources you want, your history wardrobe, your local stuff. You can cross over, perhaps not very good with EastEnders, but you can do anything with this show. And that surely is the golden model. I mean, I've always said Quantum Leap almost had it, where you've got a show which is set within the main character's lifetime of like 50 years, allowing the 50 years of the wardrobe department, which is the most likely to exist, to become the
Yes.
benchmark base mark of your stuff. Two,
Yeah.
two principal characters, an interchangeable anthology of stories. In a lot of ways, Quantum Leap is like Doctor Who for that reason. Is it's just a really good model of making diverse, broad content television, and that's Doctor Who's, as we've said many times before, it's Doctor Who's strength, which in this era has become its weakness. We are now narrowcast, even down to our opinions of what Doctor Who should be are narrowcast, and yet this show has been made to have broad appeal. Where does that exist in a world that we live in? And maybe that will
Maybe,
change.
yeah. Well, I mean, there's an argument that people are more interested in things because they are targeted in a particular way, or that they are formatted in a particular way, making Doctor Who seem more international. I don't think it was something that is kind of explicitly international, but it seems to have a more by adopting things like the Avengers base and stuff like that, but just going big in that way rather than being more British. I don't want to say British, but that's like
Yeah,
tonally British, thematically
yeah,
British, maybe.
yeah.
Um,
But
going
then,
going beyond that has maybe had the opposite effect.
but then, if in the 70s Doctor Who had the budget that it had now, would
Mm.
it have been doing the same sort of things if it could? How
Well, I
much is the
think in the
creativity
Pertwee era, it
limited?
would have been doing bigger, more elaborate action sequences, and in
But imagine,
the
imagine the
late,
Williams era.
yeah, I was going to say in the sort of late Tom Baker era, it would have been like the like the model department would have been very, very busy.
I mean, if they had the money to afford in the early 80s, if they had the money to afford guest stars like Harrison Ford
Oh
or these
yeah,
big American names, it would have totally done it. In a
oh
weird
yeah,
way, like so many
would.
projects, the limitations create the creative expanse. The boundaries of limits create the creative expanse.
Yeah,
And that's what they worked with. And I think to some degree, I think that's what Capaldi, perhaps what I don't, he doesn't say it, but I'm wondering if that's the essence of what he's almost saying is that and something's kind of limited and small, it seems more creative and exciting than when
yeah,
you've got a lot of money and it becomes this big machine. Everything starts to feel just
yeah.
big for the sake of being big and limitless and therefore a bit. So I do get it. And I think it's something that Doctor Who may have to contend with if it does continue on with the BBC, a sort of a leaner thing.
which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I
No,
mean, if we
absolutely
look at,
not.
I mean, the episodes of Doctor Who that have been famously low budget over the past 20 years or so, I mean, there's the obvious example of Midnight,
Yeah,
but there's
exactly.
also I mean, I'm not sure how low budget Blink was, so I don't want to say that's one of them. But I mean, there's a few of them where things have been very kind of comparatively limited against other episodes. But just going back to Mark Gatiss, because you mentioned something about how because which nicely ties this back actually. You said how Doctor been about the companion over the past 20 years, which yes, the old Doctor Who, the classic Doctor Who, was more about, generally speaking, and certainly for me when it was at its best, was about villains, about the bad guys.
Yeah.
Particularly, not I'm not talking necessarily. I'm really not talking necessarily Daleks or Cybermen, except maybe Genesis of the Daleks when we were introduced to Davros. So you got these big villains, and that's something that Mark Gatiss seems to do quite well with his. So, for example, you got the Unquiet Dead, where, in fairness, that's not a great example because the Gelth aren't in it that much.
Yeah.
But you
Idiot's
do have
Lantern.
this. Pardon?
Idiot's Lantern.
You do have the Idiot's Lantern, which is a very good example of this, and you've also got the Crimson Horror as well,
Yeah.
which are both good examples of big villains and both well cast as well, and who dominate the storyline and dominate the story. And I think that's something that's missing in modern Doctor Who. I like Doctor Who when it's about crazy villains. That works for me, and maybe that's a childhood of growing up on Doctor Who and Bond movies and Pink
I
Panther
think
movies from the 1970s.
I
But
think
I do like a
yeah.
crazy villain.
I think the problem with villains today, and it's been and is that there is the need to entertain audiences, which I think has become a big thing, certainly since Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where villains have to be very talkative. They have to be very larger than life. And in Doctor Who, it's almost become a thing where the villains got to match the same energy as the Doctor, which
Mm,
John Sim really did very well.
yeah.
But it does limit you to the sort of type of villains you can have. And I mean the Rani as well. I mean, we've had the Rani recently, to be fair. I mean, there was a period where I think in the Moffat era where I think Brian especially was always a bit frustrated that there was never any like proper villains. It was always entities or
Yeah.
environments that were the threat rather than actually a good, solid, as you say, adversary. But then I think in
Well, I
probably in
mean,
the bit,
remember the Power of Three?
yeah,
The bad guy was Stephen Burkoff, and he's on screen for about 90 seconds. I mean, that's just insane.
but is
You've
that
got like a classic Bond villain there, right there in Doctor Who. And, he's done villainous roles and everything. There was an episode of The Professionals I was watching the other day. He's essentially playing the same character as he played in Octopussy, but whatever. Um, and it feels like someone like that's completely wasted. He's 90, I mean, it might not be 90 seconds, but he certainly doesn't have the time to fully make the impact that Stephen Burkoff can make, which seems a shame.
maybe maybe when the sort of like the Doctor becomes so large and the story becomes so large, the sort of space for the villain becomes so much smaller. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think no, I think that is
It
a.
feels like they become less necessary.
I mean, if there is a like a triangle between the Doctor, the companion, and the villain, which inevitably, I mean, I can't think of an occasion when this doesn't happen. All three will be present at
Mhm.
the story's denouement. Then that's that's got to be there has to be an unbalancing, hasn't there? And traditionally, it would be the companion who played second or third fiddle in that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is probably the one of the big changes is that since 2005, there was a
Mm,
very push that you had two leads,
yeah,
kind of borrowing from the success of the X-Files with
yeah,
two, and that's meant to be the idea. So the need for a third talking spot becomes there's less space in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to remember in the old show, you'd obviously have a very talky villain because, again, as we've said before, you want to limit the amount of set changes you have. So if you have a set and you've got the
Yeah.
villain in there, you want to have them talking and making the most of that time. So you're limiting your costs. So they do become more talky. But then, going back, just I like the idea you said about this sort of triangulation of characters, because I always say, and everything in storytelling is about going back to your example, the power of three,
Yeah.
beginning, middle, and end. But in terms of characterizations, that sort of triangle is always very powerful. I always go to the Kirk, Spock, McCoy, where you have
Yeah.
the leader, the heart, the logic, those sort of each having a different relationship to each other. But some of the best Doctor Who's, I think, for companions have been ones where you've had very strong different connections with each other. So like Caves of Androzani is a really good one, where you have, again, it depends on who you think the villain is in that story. But Perry's relation to his name suddenly escapes me. Is it Jared?
Charles Jack.
Yeah, Jared Jack. Yeah, is very unique to the Doctor's relation to him, and the relation of the Doctor to the Perry is very. So you get a lovely sort of space. A Brain of Morbius is probably another quite good example of that as well, where you get that sort of connection. Things become more interesting, and I think you're right. I think to some degree, Doctor Who from 2005 kind of lacked that ability to do that well, and I don't think that's to do with writing. I think it's perhaps just to do with the way things were, and I think maybe thanks to the way that science fiction through things like Buffy had become very postmodern and very aware of itself, that takes away the ability of the villain to actually be scary. So I
Yeah.
think a lot of the time the villain is then removed because in a weird way that's scarier than actually having a villain who you either humanize or you end up making very silly. It's a fascinating area to explore, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it happens in, I mean, if we're looking for examples more recently, well, slightly more recently, it happens in Dalek.
Yeah, yeah,
And I think it happens in Capaldi's last episode as well, with Bill and the glass people.
yeah. I guess so. Yeah, I mean, I suppose some people would argue that was one of Moffat's "there is no real villain" sort of,
Well, yeah.
it's
Yeah.
everyone lives approach. But there's certainly, well, you can take the pilot for for Capaldi's
Yeah.
Series 13 opener, where you've got again the relationship between enemy. Again, there's not much relation to the Doctor and that enemy. I think it's when you get where there's a nice dynamic between all three is where it can become quite interesting, where there's a
Yeah.
sort of and that's sometimes hard to generate, and it depends whether your audience wants it. Do younger audiences these days work with that? And I think that's the other problem here, and this is the issue which we keep coming back to with new Doctor Who, is that it is no longer in a space where its growth audiences are in the same room as its established audiences. That doesn't exist anymore. So it's now kind of stuck trying to sell it to self to one or the other, rather than knowing there's a space where both will be there watching it, where they'll be fulfilling the ones who like it and 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 shaping the ones who will become to like it. So the young people, the young kids, because the young kids aren't watching it with their parents as much anymore. There's not that sort of space. The taste.
If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and everywhere else, then you need to subscribe to the podcast through Patreon to listen to the extended version of the podcast. And for you, it's the end of the show. I think that brings us nicely to the end of this week's discussion. Let us know what you think. You can drop us a line via email. That's podcaststerberus@gmail.com or editor@kasterborous.co.uk. You can also, when you find this on Substack, you can leave a message underneath there. There's a chat on Substack you can use. You can chat to us on Patreon as well. You can chat to us anywhere, really. We'll be back for another discussion soon. Look out for a new 500-ish episode coming along too. Until then, it's goodbye from us.